Hello everybody! I was very concerned about making this video because I think it's a very polarizing subject. I think most people will see this video and take it for what it is, but some people on one side will find racism and wrongdoing where it doesn't exist. I think some people on the other side could use it as fuel for hatred, and I hope you guys tend towards neither extreme. And I'd also like to say before I begin that when I mention China, I don't mean Chinese people, I mean the Communist Party of China. Of course, China is not all bad, and there are a lot of things that have been getting better over the years. Even though they're a communist country, they've adopted many aspects of capitalism, and that in itself is an amazing feat. They're a reasonably stable country because the ideas that the CPC doesn't agree with are not allowed. They have a huge population, and their economy is the second largest in the world, and that's despite being a developing country with a low GDP per capita of under 10,000 US dollars. For comparison, Hong Kong, which used to be ruled by the British up until 1997, has a GDP per capita of over 49,000 US dollars, which is a little more than Canada. So we have the same people group as China, but in a situation where they're allowed to flourish. And Macau, which was ruled by the Portuguese up until 1999, has a GDP per capita of over 83,000 US dollars. So China's huge economy is a big draw for investors. And since it's been held back for so long and is now taking steps towards prosperity, there's a lot of potential growth ahead of it. And Hong Kong and Macau are good examples of what China could potentially become. And that is where a lot of investors' eyes grow really wide. That potential for big profits can make people look the other way. People who might otherwise be concerned about social injustice can be persuaded to claim that the problem is too complex to be understood. But don't forget that where you put your money matters. Whether you're a consumer purchasing products and services, or an investor providing capital to businesses, you're in the process of shaping the world. We know China has a lot of good things going for it, but what are some of the potential problems with China? China's ability to adopt certain capitalist tendencies may be partially responsible for the West's acceptance of their very un-Western ways. It's easy to forget how different China is, and by extension, how different their companies can be. Especially when you're buying stocks, it may not be fresh in your mind. The fact is that the CPC is a communist regime, complete with all the issues that normally brings. Xi Jinping is a dictator, their country uses propaganda to control the masses, their citizens don't have freedom or democracy, and they're more closely akin to North Korea than the United States. Certainly, it may be a popular dictatorship amongst its people, but that's usually true of dictatorships. North Korea is another good example of a popular dictatorship, but that's just an extension of its propaganda and human rights abuses. China, even with all its advancements, is still hostile to various groups like Christians, Muslims, Falun Gong practitioners, and journalists who are critical of the government. The 2018 International Religious Freedom Report, presented by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, stated that the government tortured, physically abused, arrested, detained, sentenced to prison, or harassed adherents of both registered and unregistered religious groups for activities related to their religious beliefs and practices. There are even reports of state-sanctioned organ harvesting of these groups. Of course, I can't verify a claim like that, but you could read the Human Rights Watch's World Report from various years to find out more about what's happening in China. But you could say, well, this is their country and they can do what they want, and that might be perceived as some sort of a neutral position. But it's really just a beta position that somebody with no ability to affect change might appease themselves with. You have a say when you invest, and you're taking on the role of the most powerful people in the world. This is how powerful people bring about change. In the case of Hong Kong, China is using treason, cessation, sedition, and subversion as a pretense to crack down on pro-democracy demonstrators. The demonstrations have been going on in Hong Kong for over a year, although the 2020 crisis has put a damper on things. You might be asking, why is Hong Kong only protesting when Macau is in a very similar position? It may be, at least partially, because Macau's GDP per capita is in the $83,000 range, whereas Hong Kong's GDP per capita is in the $49,000 range. So things are going far better in Macau than they are for Hong Kong, so they have more to lose and they might be a little more timid about rocking the boat. In all fairness, it's hard to know how realistic a claim like organ harvesting is, and that's because China lacks one very important thing that all investors should be worried about, and that's transparency. Propaganda, as we know, is a pretty old method of swaying public opinion, and China's had to keep up as the world's been changing. What is often referred to as the Great Firewall of China is actually the Golden Shield Project, which blocks IP addresses and domain names. It also has keyword censorship, not unlike YouTube. YouTubers, for instance, can't say the real name of the 2020 crisis without getting demonetized. I suppose we still have a choice, but the push is towards censorship. The Great Firewall of China can also identify weaknesses in VPNs, which are meant to hide your IP address. On top of that, new laws like China's cybersecurity law criminalize VPN service providers. And you can't go on something as mundane as Facebook in China. Facebook is illegal there because independent activists were using it to communicate. What else is blocked in China? Google, YouTube, Wikipedia, Pinterest, as well as a host of other websites like Bloomberg, Breitbart, New York Times, the BBC, you name it. So yeah, lack of transparency is due to censorship and propaganda. And you can't talk about a lack of transparency without touching on the World Health Organization. Certainly, Tedros, the leader of the World Health Organization, is a pretty questionable character himself and made many mistakes in the handling of the 2020 crisis. From telling countries to not bother limiting travel, to praising China for buying the world time, while Chinese officials were arresting and punishing citizens for spreading rumors about the disease, which in hindsight were probably not rumors at all. Although in Tedros' defense, both he and other World Health Organization officials were kept out of China until late January. Until that time, he was left to parrot whatever it is that China wanted to tell him. There's a lot of media outlets already covering this, so I won't beat it to death, but essentially there's a lack of transparency in how much of the fault is China's, how much of it is the World Health Organization's. I'll leave up to you to decide. Although I do have an article that touches on this subject, and I'll leave a link in the description. So if the health of the world is of little interest to you, what about transparency issues as they affect the investment world specifically? Let's talk about reverse mergers for a minute. Back in 2011, there was a wave of Chinese companies either delisted or halted from trading on the Nasdaq. That scandal was known as the Chinese reverse merger fraud. A reverse merger involves a private company buying shares in a publicly traded shell company which has been created for that purpose. The private company just buys enough shares to become the majority shareholder, and any shareholders in the private company simply exchange their shares for shares of the new shell company. It's quicker and cheaper than arranging for an IPO, which is how most companies would normally become publicly listed. There's nothing particularly wrong with reverse mergers, but in this event, the private companies had ample space to commit fraud. And guess who loses money when the company's delisted? The investors lose the money. My point is that even back in 2011, transparency was a big issue. Somehow along the way, everybody just forgot. Now we have Luckin Coffee, which is another company being delisted by the Nasdaq. This company went from the $50 range all the way down to under $2. How do you pull that off? An accounting scandal might do the trick. The COO fabricated sales by 310 million American dollars. That's a lot of coffee, man. They were found out because of a whistleblower, and apparently more than just the COO was in on it. Trading was halted for about a month, and the COO and CEO were both fired by Luckin's board. Essentially, they lied about the numbers. And that brings us to another issue, which is accounting standards in China. Chinese companies don't follow GAAP standards. They have their own standard called the Chinese Accounting Standard. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the CAS, but there are some differences that have to be navigated. So there's another layer of difficulty involved in assessing a Chinese stock. Then there's the PCAOB, which is the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which on their own website states that they remain concerned about our lack of access in China and will continue to pursue available options to support the interests of investors, which is just a big way of saying that there's a lack of transparency. So what about Alibaba? This is one of those companies that got us all to forget the 2011 reverse merger shenanigans. And we all love Jack Ma. He's become kind of a celebrity like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. But what happens when you buy Alibaba? What do you actually own? Well, you don't own shares in Alibaba the company because that's illegal, man. That's right. It's illegal for foreigners to own shares of certain types of companies. And internet stocks like Alibaba are on that list. And when I look at Chinese stocks, Alibaba is the one. That's the one stock that I would want to buy. Luckin Coffee, I suspected the numbers were fake. Their growth was too fantastic, and the IPO that's hemorrhaging money scenario, we have that here. We know that that can be a big problem. Alibaba, on the other hand, is different. It's a company that actually looks legit. But there's a part of Alibaba that is as crappy as everything else that we get from China. And that is the pseudo company itself. Companies like Alibaba and Baidu and JD.com, they use a variable interest entity, or VI, to get around the Chinese laws. They set up a holding company that owns contracts with the original company, which are meant to mimic what owning the original company would look like. But you don't own the actual company, and you have no voting rights. And guess who loses when there's a calamity and everything has to go to court to be settled? You lose. Because Chinese courts don't care. They don't care that you found a way around their laws. They like their laws. And why wouldn't they? You can't blame them for that. But how do you factor that kind of risk into an investment? You know, what you've bought in that event is kind of nothing. And this is coming from somebody who wants to buy Alibaba, but I can't because it's junk. And what about national security threats like Huawei? And much like organ harvesting again, it's impossible to know what's going on with a company like Huawei. What we do know is that Japan, Australia, the United States, New Zealand, they're all banning Huawei from their 5G networks. And it sounds like the UK is going to join them in banning equipment from their 5G networks that Huawei is making. And the reasoning is that Huawei and companies of that ilk probably wouldn't refuse if the CPC asked them to do something unseemly like spy. Huawei is also being accused of stealing US technology from companies and in violating US sanctions against Iran. And Chinese companies have long been accused of stealing US technology. Micron, Cisco, AT&T, T-Mobile, all those kind of companies come to mind. It's been reported that the FBI is investigating over 1,000 cases of Chinese companies stealing US technology. So let's have a quick look at some headlines from a few newspapers. I think this will be a little bit eye-opening if you didn't know this kind of stuff. First we have The Atlantic. China's baffling GDP figure. Why are provincial and national economic data so different? Economic performance is still used as a major criterion for the evaluation and promotion of provincial bureaucrats. This leaves economic statistics particularly subject to political manipulation to serve officials' personal interest. What about the Australian Business Review? The truth about China's GDP numbers. Many leading international institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, have accepted that figure as an article of faith. But that's exactly what the World Health Organization did. They just repeated what China told them, much to the detriment of the world. But these other UN organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, would they do that too? Well, this article is saying they did. And it continues. However, many observers doubt the accuracy of the country's GDP figures, and even Chinese Premier Li, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, secretly confided that GDP figures in Liaoning were man-made and unreliable. And the Financial Times. China's economy is 12% smaller than the official data say, study finds. Its real growth has been overstated by about 2 percentage points annually in recent years, according to Brookings Institution, a Washington think tank. And finally, Business Insider. China's true economic growth could be half of what everyone thinks. Based on the performance of countries comparable to China, GDP growth could be as low as half the official number. Anyways, you decide. If GDP is that easy to understand, then everything else should be pretty good too. Before we go, I want to read you from BlackRock's website. An article titled 5 Myths and Realities About Investing in China. BlackRock is an investment group if you don't know. Myth. It's hard to get accurate economic data about China. Reality. Some investors wonder about the accuracy of official Chinese data. However, there are alternative sources, such as satellite imagery, mobile payments, and online marketplace volumes that can guide and inform an investment decision alongside official data. For example, tracking movements of metallic matter on the ground is a way to estimate factory buildups or expansion by region. Myth busted! It's not hard to get economic data, we have satellites. That's kind of like how China says that only about 4,000 people died from the 2020 crisis. But we can tell from people not paying their cell phone bills that the number is closer to 21 million. Because if you don't pay your cell phone bills, you're probably dead. Is that what you want to rely on? This is investing? And China just made it easier for groups like BlackRock to invest in China. They can now own 51% of financial firms. Man, if you just blindly trust these groups and have somebody else doing your investing for you, you need to get your life together. These companies will charge you a small fortune to invest in junk. You may think that headlines like delisting stocks and federal pension funds not investing in China are just political grandstanding to win a trade war. And maybe it is, but there's very real underlying issues that these theatrics highlight or exploit. A lot of people approach the stock market with a trader's mindset, meaning that they have very short time horizons. And that's not the way it should be. You need to have a relationship with these companies. You need to have a level of trust. Because China is such a problematic country with many underlying issues still going unaddressed, there is a level of risk that I think a lot of people are not noticing when they go to invest in what looks like an otherwise really great company. Even though China certainly holds a lot of values that I can't support and I would never put my financial energy behind, the point of this video really isn't that China's bad. Trying to show that China is a very different country with different risks that you should weigh and consider before you purchase stock. I'm not saying don't own Chinese companies. If you're okay with human rights abuses, a lack of transparency, and not actually owning the company you've bought, then go ahead. But remember that investing is not really something you do in China. Much like Macau, you gamble. Ultimately, for me, there's no point in investing in China when there's so many better opportunities in the United States. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like what you saw, give me the thumbs up and subscribe. And don't forget what I told you.